Thank you, Cesar. Thank you for the invitation to reflect briefly on Australia, our relationship with Southeast Asia, and this papal encyclical. It's a lot to hold together. I'm not sure that I'll actually achieve it. But what I've tried to do is read the encyclical and reflect on what does it say to us as a nation, especially in our relationships with Southeast Asia. The encyclical calls us to a universal fraternity, which I'd rather speak of as a universal solidarity. I understand why fraternity was chosen and its gesture towards the Epistle of St. Francis. Still, the sound of this gendered word clashes in an unfortunate way with the urgent social and ecclesial task of embracing gender justice. Gender justice must not also be a central part of this universal solidarity, which, as the encyclical suggests, is where there is no others, no them, there is only an us. But this can only work if we're willing to relinquish patriarchal and other forms of hierarchic power. The call to new forms of social friendship, the centrality of dialogue, importance of openness, the need for a different kind of politics, and the continual movement to include those who have been excluded will indeed be critical for the future of our global human community. If the encyclical sounds one theme for me that is louder and more clarion than all the others, it's that self-interest at an individual or a collective level, or in defending national interests, is a dead end. And that the real hope to be found is in ecstasis, going outside of ourselves, in openness and love to encounter the other. Australia has failed so many ways in our relationship with our Southeast Asian neighbours to realise the vision of solidarity that the encyclical invokes. I cannot name all the ways, but I will focus on three areas. How we fail to welcome the stranger, how our national self-interest has distorted how we reach out to our neighbour countries, and how we've become less open, more security conscious, and put militarism at the core of our national life. I acknowledge that I speak today and I stand on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And like all the land in Australia, this land has never been ceded by its traditional owners. I live and make my living on stolen land. No Australian can walk away from this unfinished business and still with any integrity speak of justice. The failure of solidarity, this failure of solidarity is at the core of our national identity. If we gather up the now well-known, documented and impossible to ignore accounts of settler wars, massacres against First People, destruction of culture and land, the injustice that continues to be perpetrated against Aboriginal people, the conclusion is impossible to ignore that our nation is founded on what is an ongoing and continuing crime against humanity. We should not be surprised that we find it difficult to establish relationships of respect and mutuality with our Southeast Asian neighbours when colonial practices and patterns of paternalism continue to be entrenched in our collective dealings with the First People of our own nation. Over the last 22 years, Australia has hardened its heart against the stranger in need. This is clearly seen in the way that Australia treats asylum seekers. For the last 22 years, we have been in contravention of international law and have denied the basic rights of people who have come to this country to seek asylum. Australia has treated innocent people like criminals. This failure is not a failure to welcome and protect only, but through our actions, we burden and abuse them further by putting them in indefinite detention against every international norm of what is legal and just. And this same lack of hospitality has been evident in how we treated international students, the majority of whom come from Asia to study in Australia. As their numbers have increased significantly over the past 18 years, we've been content to see them as a lucrative source of income to sustain our education sector. But when COVID struck and they were no longer any economic benefit, we totally abandoned them. It was left up to community groups, migrant community organisations, food banks and pantries to provide the necessities of life. I was involved in some of this food distribution, and I saw young students that were so hungry that when they received their portion, they'd go around the corner and immediately consume it. While the senseless and cruel onshore and offshore detention programs of our government consume huge amounts of resources, generate shonky contracts, there's a total decline in resources to set up those kinds of migrant settlement and inclusion programs that would really constructively welcome people into our community. Do we really think we can treat people like this and be able to keep on doing it? These asylum seekers, these new migrants, these students tell family and friends what their experience of international cruelty and neglect has been. And our reputation as a mean-spirited, self-interested nation is consolidated in the region. Our national self-interest has completely distorted the way we reach out to our neighbours in the region.
True, whoever you are.
There was a time before 2014 when Australia was held in high regard internationally, especially among our neighbours in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, for being a country that had a development assistance program that was responsive to their real needs, was participatory, was supported by highly skilled people within what was then AusAid. For over a decade, conservative political parties consistently sought to undermine the confidence of Australian people in our aid program. With the Abbott government in 2013, Australia's aid program was scuttled, and our flagship aid program went from being AusAid to WasAid. AusAid as an entity was disbanded and integrated with DFAT and its vastly different agenda. And the human resource base and institutional knowledge that Australia had developed in international development was totally trashed. The aims of the development program that remained went from being targeted at the development agendas of supported countries to being directed towards buttressing our own national self-interest.
Exactly.
The amount of aid plummeted as a percentage of our GNI. The continual undermining of the importance of development assistance in the public perception has not only allowed us to become one of the lowest aid contributing nations in the OECD, but it has also made us mean-spirited people, with a majority of Australians holding negative views of development assistance, and 80% of us clearly against increasing overseas aid as a percentage of our national budget. Being a comparatively wealthy country, a disinterested aid program has in the past been critical to building relationships of understanding and trust with our neighbours. Now, whatever aid is provided comes with the assumption that this is somehow self-serving. Even this most recent COVID support for PNG and other Pacific countries is primarily because we want to secure our poorest border regions from COVID transmission. And who can forget the gross expression of Australian self-interest in regard to Timor-Leste? Australia prided ourselves in the engagement with the international peacekeeping, and then in 2004 sent ACES agents to bug the Prime Minister's office to gain economic advantage in the Timor Gap negotiations. such ruthless and criminal action against one of the poorest countries in Asia, which we were making a pretense to assist. The scandal continues and it plays out in our courts, and the absurd charges against witness K and his lawyer, Bernard Collaery, it continues. Australia, it's become less open, more security conscious, and we put militarism at the core of our national life. The situation in Southeast Asia at present, this present historical moment is incredibly complex, as so much of the internal politics happening within countries is overshadowed by this posturing and military muscle flexing of these two dominant and clearly imperialist powers, China and the US. And just over the last week, we've heard the sabres of war rattling over our region, with rhetoric of potential war with China over Taiwan, and the myriad of actual war games and manoeuvring that currently is taking place in the region just over the last 2 weeks. The US has renewed its so-called pivot to Asia, first embarked on in the Obama era, proved to be a failure because the US was bogged down in the Middle East, but now revived under Biden. And the same characters formed the cast. Under Obama, Kurt Campbell was the one who designed the pivot to Asia, and now under Biden, he was rolled out on the first day of the Biden administration as the Asian coordinator. The pivot to Asia was always China containment, with a bit of a hearts and minds gloss over everything. We can expect more of the same, but now the stakes seem to be much higher. China's used the period of US lack of focus to significantly expand its hard and soft power across the region and beyond. Australia is, as usual, blindly bound by our attachment to the US alliance and follows where the US leads or fails to lead. US interests are, however, not Australia's best interests. Neither are those of China. We should not blindly follow the US, neither should we diminish or ignore the ambitions of China. The choice has never needed to be binary. And Australia has had opportunities in the past to do what Pope Francis is calling for in his Encyclical, to enter into the solidarity with our neighbours and engage in dialogue over our shared concerns. The Philippines has been a focus of my engagement, and it's one example of those populist regimes that the Encyclical refers to, that has a lack of concern for the vulnerable, that exploits people demagogically. President Duterte came to power through electoral victory in 2016, massive support generated by social media, later to be found out to be undergirded by infamous organisations like Cambridge Analytica and troll farms in foreign countries. Even before he took office, Duterte had launched a propaganda campaign to undermine the discourse on human rights. And then when he came to office, through clandestine agents and paid goons, he embarked on a campaign to summarily execute thousands of drug suspects. More recently, the abuse, harassment, extrajudicial killing of activists and civil society organisation leaders, which had been occurring from the beginning, but with the introduction of the National Anti-Terrorism Act in July 2020, has totally escalated. In the face of gross human rights abuses by the Duterte regime, some reliable sources say up to 30,000 people have been summarily executed in the so-called war on drugs. The Australian government has remained silent. There's currently a preliminary investigation being conducted by the International Criminal Court into President Duterte for potential crimes against humanity. Australia has been worse than silent. The draconian anti-terror laws, which are now being used against civil society activists, were drafted with the aid of the Australian government. They're modelled on our own anti-terror laws. Australia has also continued to provide significant support and training to the armed forces of the Philippines, despite the AFP's appalling human rights record. And through its visiting of forces agreement with the Philippines, we continue to engage in joint military exercises. This gross failure by Australia is in stark contrast with the appropriate action taken in response to the military coup in Myanmar, which has seen the termination of all military aid and support. Halverson and West, in a recent article, examined the history of how Australia and Philippines relate over politics and security concerns. They said that Australia always engages with its self-interest at the forefront of the relationship. This is clearly the case in the present moment, when Australia is willing to stay silent on these gross human rights abuses in exchange for the advantage it perceives it attains in the Philippines in respect to balancing Chinese influence and the so-called war on terror in the southern Philippines. In Fratelli Tutti, there is much that is said about war, but two sentences that particularly captured my attention were, "We can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits." In view of this, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. Never again war, exclamation mark. That's in the Encyclical. Australia's relationship to Southeast Asia are overshadowed, overdetermined by the possibility of armed conflict between China and the US or their proxies. Yet as the Encyclical points out, such war is in no one's interest, least of all the interests of the planet. Yet over recent decades, war has come increasingly defined who we are as a nation. There were some interesting articles in the most recent Meningian by Mark McKenna and Paul Daly, and it looked at Canberra and the War Memorial. And I was just reflecting on how in Walter Burley Griffin's original vision for Canberra, Parliament House was meant to be the spiritual centre of our democracy. But over recent times, with rhetoric from our Prime Minister, who has called the War Memorial the most sacred place in our nation. And I was reflecting that this symbolism of a Prime Minister who has outdone all others in how he has publicly identified himself as a Christian, identifying this memorial to death as the most sacred space in our nation, it's just both obscene and sad. The Australian War Memorial is not simply a monument to fallen soldiers, but it's an enterprise that gathers and preserves all things to do with Australia's military engagements. It's a building an enterprise that is now heavily sponsored by the armaments manufacturers and military contractors who make their profit out of ongoing conflicts. And as Brendan Nelson said, they work out their corporate social responsibility through financing the War Memorial. It's not democracy that represents the soul of our nation, but war. And for a Christian to claim the memorialization of death rather than celebration of life as the most sacred space is deeply disturbing. I'll not even begin to comment on what this must mean for Indigenous people and their understanding of sacred space. Australia has become, over recent decades, a significant arms exporter. None of us were asked. It happened while we were sleeping. Recent reports from the Brereton inquiry show that our overseas engagement in Afghanistan has been made up of many war crimes. And then we hear the rhetoric of military leaders and our politicians that say, this is not who we really are. We're not really like it. But the reality is this is who we have become. When it is is national self-interest that becomes the measure of what is right and wrong, then this is who Australia has become. And as I've tried to outline in what is a kind of lament for our country, as a nation, Australia is currently a long way from this vision, this amazing vision that the Holy Father articulates in this encyclical. We urgently need to dislodge our national soul from its identification with war and open up it out to the possibility of a new kind of relationship, not constructed of fear and self-interest, but of openness and love. And I think this is where the heart of this encyclical and its challenge is for us as a nation. Thank you, and Cesar, sorry for being so long.
Thank you, Andy.